Today's topic is Pride and Prejudice. Now, Pride and Prejudice is a novel that was written by Jane Austen, and it is undeniably a classic. It's got romance, it's about family, it's about social class, and it's really about understanding how the world works and how to find your place in it, where you really fit in the world. Most people, even if they haven't read the book, know Pride and Prejudice. They've either heard its name or they've watched one of its screen adaptations, which I think there are like 3 of. Personally, I've only ever seen the 2005 movie, but I have watched it well over a dozen times. I love that movie very much, but having read the book now, I must begrudgingly admit that the book is in fact better. It's better, and that's just usually how it goes, but I am still not going to stop rewatching the movie once every other month. Starting off with some context, who better to describe the book than the book itself? Let's read the blurb. Spirited Elizabeth Bennet is one of a family of 5 daughters, and with no male heir, the Bennet estate must someday pass to their priggish cousin, William Collins. Therefore, the girls must marry well, and thus is launched the story of Elizabeth and the arrogant bachelor Mr. Darcy, in a novel renowned as the epitome of romance and wit. Pride and Prejudice is Jane Austen's masterwork, an entertaining portrait of matrimonial rights and rivalries, timeless in its hilarity and its honesty. There is a lot to say about this book. I could probably go on for well over an hour while staying on topic for the project, but for everyone's sake, I will try and practice some restraint. The main character is basically Elizabeth Bennet. She's really just a gal who comes from a family of very little consequence and not much inheritance either. There are a couple times throughout the book that we are reminded of this, but there are 2 main ones I wanted to talk about. The first being Mr. Darcy's first proposal to her at Rosings, and the second when Lady Catherine decided to pay a visit at Longbourn. In Darcy's first proposal on page 181, it says that he spoke of her inferiority, of its being a degradation were they to get married, and of the family obstacles which judgment had always opposed to inclination. He's basically saying, hey, you're way inferior to me in my rank, so us getting married actually might be a bad idea, but I'm still proposing. And then the second instance I mentioned earlier with Lady Catherine, when she asked Elizabeth if the shades of Pemberley are to be thus polluted. Elizabeth recognizes her place in society, and it leads her to be a humble person. I think this is very apparent in her behavior, which is very unlike that of her youngest sister Lydia and her mother. They at times seem to have no concept of social etiquette, and Lydia's constant flirting leads her to a scandalous marriage that almost brings shame to herself and her entire family, and she acts as if she feels little to no remorse about the entire situation. Their behavior is very different to Elizabeth, who acts in a much more respectable manner when Mr. Darcy proposed for the first time. Even though Elizabeth wasn't really his biggest fan, she still recognized his proposal for the compliment that it was to her, of a man of such high standing to present her with such an opportunity. Elizabeth's humility is again on display when she doesn't allow herself to hope or believe that Darcy might ever renew his proposal to her. Even after seeing his behavior towards Elizabeth and hearing other people remark on it, it's clear that he still holds feelings for her, that he still cares about her, but she also realizes that he probably wouldn't want to be connected or married into a family that now involves Wickham, especially after he had caused Darcy so much grief in his life previously. And also, Lady Catherine probably went and smacked some sense into it about how much shame the whole situation would bring to himself and his family. Elizabeth just kind of assumes these things about Darcy. She just assumes that he thinks she wouldn't be worth all the trouble, which I think again just goes to show she doesn't think incredibly highly of herself, and she's more humble. After reading Mr. Darcy's letter that details what happened between him and Mr. Wickham, Elizabeth becomes an even more humbled person. She liked to pride herself on her ability to make out a person's character. She's very clever, and I think she knows this. Her father commented on it multiple times throughout the book, but realizing just how wrong she was about Mr. Darcy and Mr. Wickham really made her rethink things. It made her take into account her own pride and that she isn't always right about everything. She was visibly embarrassed and angry at herself for being so misguided after speaking on both men's character with such confidence. Speaking of Darcy and Wickham, a lot of the conflict in Pride and Prejudice revolves around their falling out. After Darcy's father first died, Wickham basically said, "I don't want to take orders. I just want my money and to get out of here." So he kind of walked off and really threw his life away. And then afterwards, in a scramble for some cash, he decided that he was going to marry Georgiana, Darcy's sister, who was going to receive quite a bit of inheritance money. But Darcy found out and he intervened. But he never exposed Wickham because he wanted to preserve his sister's good name and not leave her with that kind of embarrassment. This allowed him to carry on and weave his little web of lies about Darcy to Elizabeth, who was inclined to believe him. And even after she discovered the truth for herself, she also didn't expose him, again, out of respect for Darcy and his sister. But this only allowed him to continue to cause problems, this time with Lydia when he created a scandalously patched up marriage between the two of them, and then again Darcy intervened. So really this kind of worked out in Elizabeth's favor because it was Darcy's intervention that kind of led to them getting married in the end. The reason all this conflict is so important, even though it can be stressful at times, is that without it, there's no sort of satisfying ending. Had Wickham never cheated Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth's opinion of Darcy might never have been so severely negative. Darcy would never have been able to step in during Lydia's time of need, which again was a big influence in his and Elizabeth's marriage. There would have been nothing to move the plot along, and it wouldn't have been very interesting for the reader because there's no one to cheer on for them to receive their happy ending and no one to receive their righteous judgment either. A lot of the conflict in Pride and Prejudice is also a result of the time period that it takes place in. It takes place during the Regency era, which is between the Georgian and Victorian era. There was a pretty major emphasis on luxury and extravagance, and there were some pretty big divides between the social classes. This is very clear in Mrs. Bennet's behavior, whose sole purpose in life seems to be finding wealthy husbands with even wealthier connections for her daughters. She loved to point out the luxurious furniture and the opulence of estates such as Netherfield. At one point, Elizabeth even comments on the excessive extravagance of Rosings and how there seemed to be just like almost an overwhelming and ridiculous amount of windows up front. Other important locations besides Rosings include Pemberley, Netherfield, and Longbourn. These homes and the behavior of Darcy and Elizabeth at each of them kind of symbolizes their relationship and the growth of their relationship over time. Majority of their first encounters are at Netherfield, and neither one of them feel very comfortable there. Darcy is not well acquainted with the area, and Elizabeth does not feel welcome. She feels out of her element. Really, the only reason she stays there is to try and care for her sickly sister. And then at Rosings, Elizabeth's opinion of Mr. Darcy is not very high at that point in time, but she still acts civilly out of respect and duty, and she probably feels the weight of Lady Catherine's superiority complex. But Darcy is more likely to be in his element there, so much so that he feels comfortable enough to propose to Elizabeth. The next time Elizabeth and Darcy encounter each other is at Pemberley, which is Darcy's home. It's really representative of him and who he is. It's where he grew up. It's what he puts so much time and effort into maintaining and improving, and it's where Elizabeth sees him for who he truly is and realizes that she may very well be in love with him. And that's what Longbourn is like for Elizabeth. It's where she grew up, and it is the last place that they encounter each other before actually getting engaged. It does make sense, since the places that are most representative of them are where they feel at ease and like they can be truly themselves. The time period Pride and Prejudice was written in influences not only some of like the important themes of the book, like social classes and the divide between them, but it also heavily influences like just how it was written, like the word choice that's used and the formatting of the sentences. An example is, after a while I was reading, I noticed that instead of saying she said, it would be said she. And it's very clear in the way they speak to one another and just the words they use, the way they speak. It's not really how we talk anymore. Like, it says, page 39, "Indeed I have, sir," was her answer. "She is a great deal too ill to be moved. Mr. Jones says we must not think of moving her. We must trespass a little longer on your kindness." No one talks like that anymore. Nowadays, instead of saying all that, someone would just be like, "Yeah, the doctor said she's still too sick to be moved. We're sorry for the inconvenience, but she's gonna have to stay here for a little longer." Not whatever all this was. Although Elizabeth is the main character and most things are from her perspective, we do get peeks on occasion into the mind of other characters, which gives it more of a third-person omniscient feel. Like, we'll sometimes get to see their anxiety or their joy on a certain matter. There are even scenes where Elizabeth is fully absent, and the reader gets to stay behind to get some inside information. An example of this would be on page 33 and 34. Elizabeth walked to Netherfield to see Jane because she was feeling unwell, and after she leaves the room, the Bingley sisters and Mr. Darcy talk about her a little bit, and here's what they say. "Yes, and her petticoat. I hope you saw her petticoat, 6 inches deep in mud, I am absolutely certain, and the gown which had been let down to hide it, not doing its office." "You observed it, Mr. Darcy, I am sure," said Miss Bingley, "and I am inclined to think that you would not wish to see your sister make such an exhibition." "I am afraid, Mr. Darcy," observed Miss Bingley, in half a whisper, "that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes." "Not at all," he replied. "They were brightened by the exercise." This scene is a bit important, though, because it shows that if Darcy's dejection is so very apparent, then he really does care about Elizabeth, and it really does affect him no matter how high and mighty he thinks he may be. This scene is very telling about the Bingley sisters and that they're very snobbish people, but we also get to see more of the beginnings of Mr. Darcy's attachments to Elizabeth. There are many reasons why an author chooses to write a book from a single perspective or multiple perspectives. A common example, which is very infuriating, is the miscommunication trope. So like the main character will be overhearing a conversation that their best friend is having with someone but they'll be having it in secret. And so the main character will hear the best friend say something like, "You're right, main character is so weird." And so the main character gets so upset and they just storm off. They don't want to hear the rest of the conversation. And if that's all we saw, then we think, wow, that is a really bad friend. Good for the main character for storming off. We don't want that friend in their life anymore. But if we got to see it from multiple perspectives, we would stay behind and see the best friend say something like, "Yeah, main character is so weird. But aren't we all a little weird? I like that about the main character. That's why they're my friend." And we'd be like, "Oh, they're not a bad person. They were standing up for their friend." But the friend doesn't know that. So part of the reasons that the author will choose a certain perspective, it's to choose how we view certain characters. It kind of guides us on how we see them, what to think about them. It really builds conflict and suspension throughout the story, and it can also set up for a bit of dramatic irony. A specific example of dramatic irony in Pride and Prejudice is on page 201. It's when Lady Catherine talks about Mr. Darcy's departure from Rosings, and she says, "But I am particularly attached to these young men, and know them to be so much attached to me. They were excessively sorry to go, but so they always are. The dear Colonel rallied his spirits tolerably well till just at last. But Darcy seemed to feel it most acutely, more I think than last year. His attachment to Rosings certainly increases." She believes that he is upset because he doesn't want to leave her and he doesn't want to leave Rosings, but we know, because we've seen other things happen, we know that this is not the case, and Darcy is upset because he just got rejected by Another Elizabeth. Example of irony that I enjoyed is on page 11 when Darcy says, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men." He's talking about Elizabeth here. I don't really have anything profound to say about this. I just thought it was kind of funny and wanted to share. Another form of figurative language comes in the form of hyperbole. On page 109, Elizabeth has just denied Mr. Cullen's marriage proposal, and Mrs. Bennet is very upset with her and says, "I told you in the library, you know, that I should never speak to you again, and you will find me as good as my word." Now, one does not have to read much further at all to know that Mrs. Bennet isn't at all serious about this. But she loves to be overdramatic, and saying that she will never again speak to her child for not marrying someone is exactly that. Now, I have 3 older brothers. I have been on the receiving end of the silent treatment many a times, and it never lasts for more than a couple hours, but it kinda sucks. You know, the fear that they might just continue ignoring you kind of makes you think, maybe I should have listened to them in the first place. Maybe I should just go do what they asked me to. And that's obviously what Mrs. Bennet is trying to do here with her hyperbole. Even though it doesn't work, it was a good try. All in all, I think it was a very good book. I would probably give it 5 stars. And that is all I have to say.